Lylan 12.14, March 28, 2311 AD. The final exhibit on the tour depicted the death of Daniel Dwyer. It was a life-size, three-dimensional replica of 2 rooms, with every inch of them reproduced as accurately as possible, down to the last detail. The first was the dining area in Dr. Patrick Foster's home, and the second was that of Hannah Dunn's secret cottage where she'd stolen away with Daniel. This was, of course, after he'd killed the president, and after she'd helped him escape from the hospital. In the first room, there were statues of the 3 of them, most prevalently a pitch-black statue of the disembodied spirit of Daniel Dwyer, forever gazing into a glowing red ball on the end of his right wrist. The statue was so dark and was lit so effectively in comparison to the rest of the exhibit that it really did simulate the appearance of the spirit. It was the dark of nothing, just like Daniel. The statue of the doctor depicted him having his hands up as if in surrender, looking at Daniel's form with fear and hesitation in his eyes. The doctor's face was particularly well crafted, as was Nathaniel's, his being the 3rd statue, the other person that had been in Dr. Foster's living room that day. Nathaniel was depicted with a contorted, enraged face, seen yelling at the spirit and pointing at the doctor with hate that you could feel from the ages through the artist's rendering. In the second room, there was a replica of Daniel's living body, asleep on the floor in Hannah's cottage, curled into a ball around his toy, clutching it in his right hand, and a statue of Hannah standing beside him, watching him sleep with an adoring gaze upon her face. The tool of his undoing, the butcher knife, was painted into the backdrop where it had been known to be sitting on the countertop in the kitchen. The hilt of it alone was visible from the depicted vantage point. When they approached the first room, depicting Dr. Foster's house, the curator put his hands behind his back, bowed his head, and said, "Let us observe 10 seconds of silence in remembrance of Dr. Patrick Foster." Emma and Rosa Carter also lowered their heads and put their hands behind their backs, a sign of respect, the new physical component that accompanies such acts of observation as the recognition of the past acts of fallen heroes like Dr. Foster, and for other instances of mourning and showing respect. People didn't put their hands over their hearts or fold their arms or their hands or close their eyes or fly flags or salute anymore. They lowered their heads and put their hands behind their back. This was the new way that in which respect was subtly demonstrated, one of the little ways in which Daniel had changed the entire world just because he could, just because it made them a little more submissive. Docile posture breeds docile behaviors. The nervous system is a 2-way street. It can learn from changes in orientation to the musculoskeletal system to affect change to the endocrine system, the system which dictates hormonal homeostasis, which will change the way a person thinks over time. It was a tactic devised by mankind ages ago, and he made effective use of it. Hemhut, entombed deep in the earth's core, trained his focus on Emma, and had done so ever since he'd first heard her voice change alongside her first step in becoming Lylan, having reached sexual maturity and come into her meager powers. The small sampling of the vision of Lylan endowed her vessels. She was not Lylan yet, but she would be soon, and the giant was growing restless. If ever there was going to be a chance of him saving his love, it would have to happen soon, and he simmered with hate for the demon and stewed in the dark inferno of the churning core, and felt helpless in his inability to reconcile following the word of his love and rescuing her from the fate she had described to him. His desperation would, in the end, let fly his hand, and he would destroy everything that Lylan had spent ages building, thwarting thousands of years of careful planning in an instant. For the demon is not destroyed in the end as planned. Daniel Dwyer goes on, condemned to suffer an endless death until the end of time and beyond, for in truth, the destructive power of her machine was never meant for the demon. The 10 seconds had passed, and the rest waited to lift their heads and bring their hands around until cued by the movements of the curator. Then he said, "And now another 10 seconds of silence to honor Miss Hannah Dunn." And they again collectively bowed their heads and again placed their hands behind their back. Emma found her consciousness drifting amid the silence, and used the time to search the populace once more for information about the bizarre events surrounding the impossible volcanic eruption that she predicted, and again she came up empty-handed. She was expected to make a speech before undergoing the blessing, and she had intended to keep it brief and essentially just express gratitude for Daniel's part in saving the people, for she alone could never have saved them, or so she would say. What she'd learned about the volcano, however, had sent her concept for the forthcoming speech in a different direction, and as she watched and listened to herself saying the modified version of her speech in the near future, she liked what she heard, so she kept the changes. She would reveal to the world a foreboding so dark it ought to have rendered them speechless and horrified. Yet, it would be met with much applause when she actually reveals to them that there may actually be some merit to the notion that she herself is the cause of all the problems she solves. If Daniel were not so overconfident, he may have considered her conjecture worthy of exploring, and perhaps have concluded that bestowing the blessing to one such as Emma Carter may not be such a good idea. But Daniel had not known fear since he was being raped as a child, and remembered none of it, none of his life. So, he didn't consider anything at all to be a threat to him, let alone one of his very own children, and least of all his little Emma Carter. She adored him, and he knew it well. He was a fool. He would this day learn what it means to fear, and that fear would have a name. His Emma would be stolen away, her mind replaced by Lylin, and Lylin would then take from him much more than just Emma. The end of civilization was nigh. The hour of his reckoning had come. Within short time, every last human being on earth would be dead, and only the demon would remain. The culmination of a vision of the future that predates any concept of Lylin's inventions by many tens of thousands of years, set into motion on another world around another sun by a being who could very easily and quite reasonably have been misconstrued as a god, the Hamhat of Lylin. All of the pieces were falling together. It would all be over soon. The curator lifted his head and brought his hands around, prompting the others present to follow, and said, "The circumstances surrounding the tragic death of Daniel Dwyer make for, in anyone's opinion, one of the most interesting stories and comprise one of the most fundamental turning points in all of history. The events are well known and have been reconstructed in film and on stage consistently for more than 2 centuries. So before I begin, do either of you have any questions?" Emma knew the history back and forth and up and down, and Rosa was too anxious for her forthcoming blessing to think, so they both replied with a no. Half of it was a lie. The events depicted in the first room were based on fact, corroborated by audio and video evidence from the doctor's surveillance system. The representation of the events in the second room and the accompanying literature did not tell the whole story, and part of it was a plain lie, the part about Hannah's death. For she did not die of natural causes the way that Daniel claimed. She was suffocated. In reality, many aspects of Daniel's life were misunderstood, many of which he himself would only learn about once revealed to him by Lylin, when, after a small demonstration of her power, she starts berating him while dragging him around the earth by the throat in a few hours, such as why it was that Nathaniel Reddington could control him in the first place, and why the 8-ball was instrumental in keeping him in his helpless state. Every second that passed brought Emma closer to her blessing, and to the accidental awakening of Lylin. Daniel was doomed. Alexander 17, December 2nd, 45,745 BC. It had been over 50 years since the departure of the Amalgamator, along with the rest of the Tuwalans, and Lylin was feeling the weight of her decision to stay behind. Hamhut was not oblivious to the loneliness of his love, and so he resurrected a Babbitt cat, a miniature one, for her to care for. He was going to show it to her today. It was her birthday. The calendar of the Tuwalan year did not correspond with the calendar on Earth because Tuwala's orbit differed relative to its star. In comparison to Earth's year, her birthday would be celebrated on a different day annually. She awoke that morning and called for Hamhut. He was outside, as he always was in the morning, watching the sky, fending off the offenses of nature as it ferociously clamored to steal his love away from him. Half of Papa Adoa was now under ice, as was the rest of Tuwala. accounting for the area that remained under Hemhut's protection and those of active volcanic and geologic activity, only 9% of the surface of the planet had been spared from the freeze. "Hello, Hemhut," Leyland said as she approached him, green grass underfoot and warmth in the clean air around her. After the first time that Hemhut had observed Leyland critiquing her aging form in the mirror, the dulling of her blue fur and onset of gray and the withering of musculature, he had halted and begun subtly reversing the effects of aging to her appearance, and as time went by, she only looked more and more like her younger self. But she was in truth growing old. She loved the cute, friendly little Babbitt, and cooed when, instead of a flower wreath, he turned to face her that morning, said hello to her, wished her a happy birthday, and presented her with the small cat-like creature. "Oh, it's a Babbitt cat. Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked as she took it into her arms. "Does it have a name? It's so cute." And she nuzzled her nose against that of the little ball of fur, smiling upon it, immediately in love with it. "It's a boy, and I thought that you would like to name him. After all, I love the name that you gave me," he said. "Tahoa, I don't know," she said. Who does he look like to you?" "It wouldn't be fair for me to say," Hemhut said. "I already know what you're going to name him, so he looks like who he is to me." "How can you already know what I'm going to name him if I haven't made up my mind yet?" she asked. "Isn't it possible that I could give him one of many names?" "No," he said. "You always give him the same name." "But aren't there different versions of the future?" she asked. "No," he said. "The future only happens once, just as the events of the past happened only once. Therefore, there is only one future." "Hemhut," she said, pondering why she had never asked the question before. "How is it that you can see into the future?" "The same way that I see into the past, my love," he said. "Remember, I see from everywhere, and I watch everything all at once from every place. Depending on where I am seeing from, I see the entire past and future history of every place along with its relative present. Remember that time and space are the same thing, and I am always looking at everything from everywhere at once. From the far reaches of infinity, everything appears as it was in the first moments of existence. Moving further in, perception of time is accelerated, as I can see both the light and the reality. Collectively, in the places where I am accelerating, particularly in those places of high gravitational energy, I see all the way until the end of time, and there is only one timeline." She thought about it. It didn't make sense to her. She looked up at him, petting and scratching her sweet new companion. "What about free will?" "There is no such thing, my love," he said. "There is only the perception of the ability to institute change. But the oneness of time renders all possibilities null but the one true future. There are not two futures, therefore there is only one future." "That can't be true," she said. "What if I decided not to name him? What would we call him then?" "It is true, my love," he said, "and there is science to support it. Neuroscientists and neurobiologists of my homeworld will do extensive research on the topic and discover that there is an impulse originated electrically in the brain that precedes the development of any decision. In short, determining that decisions are made for you from deep within one's subconscious mind, almost as if attuned to the dance of forward time progression, fitting animals into the roles destined for them. Consider the seemingly conscious decisions of life forms with no brains. They are not commanded by a central nervous system. Their nervous system is an extension of their environment. Does simple life have free will, living at the mercy of their world, forced to adapt or die? No. It swashes with the flow of time toward its inevitable fate, carried by the ebb and flow of tides from an ocean it cannot hope to perceive. The same is true of higher life forms. It is the arrogance of the thinking mind which presumes autonomy where there is only predestiny. Even I cannot change the future, even with my grand vision of it. For if I do not fulfill the role that to which I am privy, reality will suffer incredibly as a consequence while the universe fights to protect itself from annihilation. I created the universe. If I sufficiently alter its path, I risk preventing my own birth, thereby endangering all of existence. Even if that were not true, simply having such knowledge of my future actions negates the temptation to risk bringing about change. And you do name him. Like I said, I already know his name." She gave him a crooked, playfully stern look and said, "You surprise me every day, Hemhut, but you just gave yourself away. It is possible for you to change the future, you just refuse to do it. That means that there is a way to change the future." "No, it doesn't," Hemhut said. "Consider any attempt by one like me who should come after me to change the future that I know to be true. Even if they could choose between possible future timelines, even if they perceived that they had 1,000,000,000 timelines to choose from, they would invariably choose only the one true future. The same is true of me. It does not matter what I do, the future will always be the same. There are in fact an infinite number of paths that all congeal into the same destination. Wounds could in theory be inflicted on the timeline, but it would always heal, having forever been destined to bear the scar. In other words, I could tell you what name you give your new friend, but I won't, and there is no future in which I ever will, because it's something I just wouldn't do. And who am I? I, like you, like every living thing, am an animated wing of otherwise inanimate matter, shaping my little corner of reality. Do you get it? The universe itself is in command, the laws of physics and nature themselves the only true measure of rule. Life itself is but a means to an end. Trying to arrest control of the future from the might of the natural processes of existence is seemingly impossible. I am powerful, but not that powerful." "You are not making sense, Hemhut," she said. "Answer me in a few sentences. Can you change the future or not?" "No," he said. "The future happens only once. Any change I believe I could effect would be always only in line with the future for which I was always destined, regardless of what I think I am meant to do, regardless of what I see myself doing from a distance. It is just as I did by changing things here on Tawala before I had clarity of mind and any true cognizance of the future. It was always meant to be. By actively effecting change, I was actually ensuring the unfolding of the one true future. Destiny is destiny. Fate is fate." She lifted up the Babbitt and made baby faces at it. "Maybe you're right. Destiny is destiny and fate is fate. I like it, Hemhut. Meet Fate. Fate Agnot." "Hello, Fate Agnot," Hemhut said as he lightly petted the tiny Babbitt with one of his giant fingers. "You win," she said. "I don't like it, but I can't see things the way that you can. So if you say that there is only one future and that free will is an illusion, Fate and I will take your word for it. It seems like you contradict yourself, like you are walking your predetermined path consensually and could effect true change if you wanted to, but in realistic terms I cannot argue your point that the future happens only once. So, though I can't reconcile the inconsistencies presented by the concept of having no free will in the face of one who can see the future and could actively contradict their set path, if you want to pretend like you are a prisoner, I won't set you free. But I am calling you out. You could choose to take a different path and potentially destroy all of existence if you so decided. I think that you are intentionally living out your perceived future because you fear the consequences of stepping off of your path. Hemhut, how do you really know that existence would be erased by your misstep if in reality you have never deviated from your perceived destiny? One thing that I've learned from my time in the universe, he said, is that a balance pervades all of time and space. The reason that there is a reciprocation for my every action, a bad result for every intended positive change, an unavoidable byproduct for every production, is because the universe itself will not allow for its own extinction. It lives a brief time, and then it annihilates, reforms, and repeats the process, much like its baser components, and it will not allow for any insult to its formative conditions, nothing that could altogether prevent it from birthing. That is the plain truth of the matter. If I deviate from my path, as you say, the universe will fight back potentially at the expense of life in the cosmos, and much misery could result. Any life form or collective thereof that should become advanced enough, knowledgeable enough to threaten the existence of the universe, would do so to their own detriment. The universe will not be undone. Lylin set little Fate down, and it walked in circles, sniffing the surrounding ground and exploring the area. Hemhut looked at the little ball of fluff and said, "There is one condition to keeping Fate Adnot, my love. Fate must stay outside with me at night. He must not sleep in the palace with you. He must sleep in my company." "Why?" she asked, crouching down to give the cute little Babbitt cat more love and scratches. "Otherwise, Fate will use up precious resources needed to sustain you, my love," he said simply. "Wait, Hemhut, what are you saying?" She looked up at him. "You are not going to do what I think you're going to do, are you?" "How old do you think Fate is, Lylin?" he asked. "I don't know. He looks like he's at least 2 or 3 months old," she said. "No, he was just brought to life this morning. Remember, the cats of this world are all extinct," he said. "The body I used to resurrect him is more than 60 years old, so he is at the same time both 1 day old and over 60 years old." Lylin just stared at him. She thought Fate was wonderful, a very thoughtful gift. That notion was now sullied by the cold reality that Fate was dead, and had been so for a long time, and was only being artificially animated by Hemhut to entertain her. Somehow it didn't seem the same. She still loved Fate, but she never let go of the realization that Fate did not love her back, because it was not real in the way that she was. She could not fight a tear from coming to her eye, already so in love with the fake little wisp of fuzz, when she asked him, "So then, you are going to kill him every night and bring him back to life every morning?" "I'm sorry, my love," he said, "but every breath he takes robs you of air. His every meal, food from your belly." Lylin began to cry. What had her life become? She was suffering in paradise. Even a gift so precious as Fate bestowed her was wrought with the desperation that had bound her here, and reeked of sadness and hopelessness. This was going to be the rest of her life. For years to come, the only time that she would feel better was when they were dancing together, little Fate twirling and watching excitedly, bereft of independent thought or control over his actions, a little furry puppet, its every movement dictated by Hemhut. This was how she lived out the rest of her days, silently sad, quietly lonesome. The novelty of having Hemhut to herself on their very own planet had long gone, and she secretly prayed for death to come. Her every material desire was satisfied. Hemhut could conjure for her any and all things she could ever want. She need only ask or imply what would make her happy. But there came a point when she concluded that nothing was going to make her happy. Suffering is part of the development of a healthy psyche, but considering that there was no escape for her, she was truly without hope. She would soon be dead, and what would her life have been? In the years approaching her death, as if by some measure of acknowledgement of her coming end, she again became appreciative of her remarkable life and of Hemhut, and she would in her mind reprieve him of any perceived blame, dying while having recently given thanks for the life he'd given her, only loving him as she truly did, passing to the next world with no contempt for him in her heart whatsoever. The peculiar thing about it was that this expression of change to her subconscious came as she approached death, even though Lylin herself was completely unaware of the fact that she was dying, as Hemhut hid the truth of her frail state from her, and shielded her from the fear of death for as long as he could, his last gift to her. She still had many years left, but she was mortal after all, and years are not as long as they seem. They danced near the waterfall as the sun set on her birthday, and Fate danced clumsily alongside them in the firelight. Hemhut was aware of her sadness, and it made him sad, but he knew that she would resurface before the end. He had foreseen that the Lylin that loved and adored him was still inside of her, waiting to turn her gaze his way again. There was nothing more that he could do to satisfy her, as much as he would have given to do so. Her sadness was hers to overcome. When she was sad, he was sad, but he tried not to show it, and he tried everything to brighten the spirits of his amazing love. Deep down, the happy girl he once knew was buried, but he could not excavate her. She would have to battle through her self-imposed layers of misery, and realized the objective truth that her feelings were hers to control, and that she could make her own happiness in the same way that she had made her own misery. It was entirely about perception, and before the end she would realize this and forcibly change her perspective to find joy in that which the day before had brought her misery, and return the Lila to him that had drawn him from the mountainside, the happy, affectionate girl that he loved. As they prepared for nightfall, Lila picked up Fate Ignat and kissed his little forehead and rubbed her nose against his. She didn't realize that as she looked into Fate's eyes, she was seeing a glimpse of her own destiny. As she drifted off to sleep, the life drained from the little Babbitt, and it laid, a clump of shriveled flesh, cloudy eyes sunken deep into concave eye sockets, matted fur around its rigid limbs, next to Hemhut's feet as he battled the sky through the night. He was not alone, finally not alone, and he wasn't going to let something as trivial as death keep him from his happiness. He resurrected Fate moments before she awoke the next morning and sent him scampering into the palace to jump up and climb the sheets of her bed and greet her just as she was sitting up and stretching her arms out. This made her happy, despite knowledge of it being a mere show for her benefit, and she pet and scratched and kissed it and said, "Hello, Fate." The smile crept from her face as she for a moment pondered the implications of the words that had just left her mouth. But she shook them off as the Babbitt chirped at her, climbed down, and started spinning in place on the floor, stopping every few seconds to give her a goofy little look from under its mop of fur. She got down on her belly on the floor and played with the little cutie, allowing it to chase her fingers and chew lightly on the tips when they were caught. Fate was so clumsy, he actually fell over a few times while trying to catch her fingers and would roll around and kick his hind legs as he righted himself when he fell on his back. He seemed to have boundless energy and responded when she howled and chirped at him, as if they were talking to one another in a Babbitt cat language. Her day was getting off to a good start. After a few minutes of relishing their playtime, she, with a big smile, said, "Come on, Fate," and rubbed her fingertips together to bid it follow her as if in search of some scent, and they walked the length of the shimmering palace and found Hemhut outside. She shielded her eyes from the sun for a moment. Then Hemhut spawned a cloud in the sky to block the light from her eyes, he himself never moving, just staring at the stars through the veil of color invading the sky, standing guard as always. "Hello, Hemhut," she said as she approached him. Fate, upon sight of the giant, ran excitedly up to him and started jumping up in attempts to scale his leg. "Hello, Lila," he said, and he knelt to allow Fate to climb onto his lap, and he gently scratched the little Babbitt. Until Fate's little tongue came out for a lick or a glint of its eyes was caught, it was sometimes difficult to tell which end was which. His little tail was not much longer than his fluff, and unless it was wagging, it was altogether difficult to discern. "Well, it feels more like a birthday to me today. Let's have fun today, no serious talk, okay?" she said, smiling as she too climbed onto his lap, stood and threw her arms around him. She looked as she did 15 years earlier, no older in appearance for having had another birthday, and the thought occurred to her that she had lost track of how old she was, mostly due to her incessant reluctance to discuss her age as she grew older, especially after experiencing the end of her reproductive cycle and no longer going into heat. She suddenly realized that she had, by refusing to acknowledge her own aging, in reality truthfully forgotten her real age, and could only guess how old she actually was. So she asked him, "Hemhut, how old am I now?" He looked back up at the sky and stood. Lila took Fate into her arm and climbed up to her perch on the giant's shoulder and was a little unnerved by his response. He said, "And you are 1 day older than you were yesterday, my love." They set off for the fruit grove. Lila wanted to press him further, but heeded her own words, "No serious talk today," and instead let it go. She knew that she was getting older, but she didn't feel older. She knew that he was doing something to her, but she didn't ask about it. She didn't want to spoil the day that had begun so right with her over-analytical thinking and prowess for dissecting the most pleasant things to their baser, less provocative realities. She wished from well within her heart that she could be happy, and she feigned happiness for the sake of her love, but her sadness ran deep. So deep that her every attempt to pretend to be happy in itself only made her more depressed. Hemhut could do nothing for her. She was living out her destiny, as was he, as was little Fate. Everything happens for a reason. Everything.